I'm Rafał Sobolski, and I chair the Global Studies Research Network, and I'm delighted to introduce our plenary speaker, David Chandler. David is Professor of International Relations at the University of Westminster in London. He's editor of the open access journal Anthropocenes, Human, Inhuman, Posthuman. His research interests focus on analysis of policy interventions in the international arena. This includes humanitarianism, state building, and the promotion of resilience. He's also interested in contemporary theories challenging the anthropocentrism of modernity and modernist thought, particularly in relation to the Anthropocene, the politics of critique, and also new technologies. He has published around 20 books, authored and edited, and around 200 chapters and journal articles. And David's recent books include Anthropocene Islands, International Relations in the Anthropocene, Resilience in the Anthropocene, and Becoming Indigenous. And David will talk about COVID-19, the process ethics of Anthropocene authoritarianism. David, we are absolutely delighted to have you here. And so over to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rafał. And I'm just going to set my little phone alarm for 28 minutes because I've been told I should talk for about 30 minutes. It's always awkward doing sort of plenary things where you don't necessarily know the people involved. And obviously it's much more awkward doing an online event where you have less of a sort of relationship with the audience. You can't see the faces sort of looking confused or looking happy or sad or whatever. And so it's a little bit alienating. However, needs must. Hopefully, I mean, the conference title is After Pandemic. So that's like a pretty positive approach to have. So I didn't attend the first keynote or the first plenary session, so I'm not really sure what the sort of vibe or the ethos was that you've established. But I guess my plenary presentation is less upbeat. It's less sort of after the pandemic, and I'm sort of trying to draw out, discuss ways in which we think about governing in relationship to the pandemic and COVID-19. And I guess I'm going to suggest that COVID-19 itself shouldn't be seen as an event or a turning point, although that's generally the way we discuss things. But the way we perceive them and respond to them is normally shaped by our existing sensitivities and our previous experiences. And so I'm going to probably locate our response to COVID-19 in a broader set of sensitivities of the crisis of modernist thought, modernist ways of governing. The period that we live in is sometimes called the Anthropocene. So I don't really know that. The audience, what you think about these things. I'm a little bit worried that I have a lot of words in my sort of title, process ethics, Anthropocene, authoritarianism. I'm also sort of talking about ontopolitics rather than biopolitics. So, you know, these are all like taking a huge risk, no idea what people are going to think about those things. I know that Rafał has been working on COVID-19 governance, thinking through biopolitics, although I haven't had the opportunity to read your latest piece, which I think is still forthcoming. But maybe there's going to be some sort of friction, tension, productiveness there, or maybe not. It's very difficult to tell. So I was thinking about my paper. Yeah, so that's what I'm going to be looking at. And the negativity thing about it is I want to suggest that in our contemporary age and heightened or sensitized by discussions around the pandemic and COVID-19, that our thinking about politics, particularly around democracy, autonomy, freedom, rights-centered thinking, human-centered approaches, traditional modernist, liberal democratic frameworks, I think are in trouble. I think that they're problematized. And people in the audience at home, you might say, well, for good reason. And I do want to sort of say that there seems to be some compelling arguments for the need to rethink how we think about things. But I want to draw out on the negative side, of course, that's my job, to be negative and critical about stuff. I want to draw out some potential problems with this rethinking, which is why I'm talking about a process ethics, a non-modern type of ethics where we do politics. And I'm sort of attaching that to authoritarianism, not a traditional way of thinking about authoritarianism with like police and batons and tanks and, you know, censorship and stuff, even though those things do exist, obviously, in our own countries and around the world and elsewhere. I want to talk about a different type of authoritarianism. So those are a few things. So that's like the background context. And I want to say that everything has changed. I want to like, yeah, I've done the background context. Now I'm giving you a sort of like, this is what I'm going to say. This is like the conclusion, that politics is back to front and upside down. And it's not just something that's just happened, but we become maybe increasingly aware of it. I want to draw that out through our discussions around COVID-19 about the nature of this back to frontness, maybe in a slightly provocative way, because that's the point of keynotes and plenary things. They're not meant to be closing discussions. They're meant to be opening them up. That's the sort of idea anyway. So in a nutshell, and I didn't put this in the title, although I should have done, I'm going to talk about the trope, the key expression of our COVID-19 times, I want to argue, is no return to normal. I want to argue, and I'm hoping that people are familiar with sort of expressions of, you know, one thing that we've learned from this crisis and all the rest of it is that we can't just be complacent. We can't just go back to normal. Obviously, we want to like go back to normal in the sense of opening pubs and being, you know, having conferences in real life and all the rest of it. So we want the return of good things, but we don't want to return to exactly how things were. We understand that the normal, the way things were, the status quo was problematic. So problematic, in fact, that like we contributed to our problems, that COVID-19, its impact, its emergence, everything about it, in fact, is something that our ways of thinking, our ways of organizing, our ways of relating to each other, to nature, to consuming, to production, to the way we organize and think about politics, we all have contributed to that. And in a future, in a world in where we do have threats and problems along these lines, or other issues that we're not really fully able to plan for, we need to be thinking about not returning to normal and being blind to those threats. That's what I want to talk about. And I want to talk about how that changes everything. That in the past, we had a much more positive understanding of ourselves. We were great, and external threats and problems were external and they were problems. I want to sort of suggest that COVID-19 alerts us to a different way of thinking about threats and problems and thereby governing in relation to them. So this morning, I was thinking about my presentation. I was also just having breakfast like people do. Oh, and by the way, I'm in the UK, so this is my like late afternoon. I know that if you're in Canada, I don't know if anyone is, but if you were to be in Canada, it would be your morning and stuff. Anyway, in the morning, I was listening to Radio 4, blah, blah, normal sort of Guardian type of news program. And they occasionally promote books that just come out. Books come out in Britain probably 6 months after they come out in America and Canada. You know, depends on the publishers. Anyway, they were interviewing a guy, Lawrence Wright. He's like a famous author and journalist. And his book is called The Plague Year, America in the Time of COVID. And it's like a really big seller and people were discussing it. And so the author was explaining his views and stuff like that. I only sort of pick on this just as one example of how COVID-19 is discussed, just in case you think that my no return to normal is something I've made up. I know you wouldn't think that. I can't see anyone sort of looking questioning and stuff. So anyway, so the author Lawrence Wright is on there and he's talking about how America was humbled, how we were really shocked by COVID-19. And before COVID-19, we were like pretty happy. We were in a good place. We had like the most advanced sort of medical care. the best economy, the best security thinking. There was even a special study, the Global Preparedness Study, that surveyed how countries were prepared for pandemics and stuff. And America came out top, best country, best prepared, all the rest of it. Think about COVID-19 though, of course, it wasn't so good. America didn't do so well. It was a shock. It was unexpected. It raised questions about ourselves, how good we are, and maybe we were being a little bit hubristic in rating ourselves number one on top of everything, when the real world seemed to beg to differ. Anyway, so Lawrence Wright, he's doing, he's a journalist, so it's an empirical book, and he's interviewing doctors on the front line, different people in American society, looking at their responses, and how the COVID-19 impacted on their lives. Anyway, the key things he revealed was that America wasn't brilliant. Now, I'm just saying this is just the plan of how we approach no return to normal. America wasn't brilliant. One of the reasons why COVID had such a negative impact was that there was a lack of trust in authorities, that people were like pretty autonomous, and just because doctors and other people said they had to do something or not do something, didn't really mean that they did it. It meant that there was like revealed a rift within society, a sort of fragmentation, a breakdown, sets of divisions that made it quite difficult to deal with issues like coronavirus. So there's social distrust of authorities, minority groups, particularly out of the loop, particularly badly hit by coronavirus, the impact of economic inequalities, even a political culture, maybe a macho, white, masculine culture of how we do politics. And it's really important not to emphasize difficulties and problems, but like, you know, stiff upper lip, get on with it, that sort of thing. We don't want to show weakness in the face of the enemy. Coronavirus is just like a war or a struggle against something else. Anyway, so it's not a particularly novel approach. The impact, though, the purpose of the book on the plague here is that we learned something. We saw ourselves differently. Coronavirus was like a mirror holding up to society, in which we saw something that was very different from what we told us we were. So the point that I'm making about the coronavirus is that it wasn't just articulated as a threat, as a problem, as a danger. It's also articulated as something maybe even helpful, maybe even a benefit, because without coronavirus, we wouldn't have been able to reflect upon our social, political, economic institutions and our way of life, our approach to things, our political culture, and those sorts of issues. So interestingly, in fact, you might argue counterintuitively, coronavirus is seen as helping us rather than just being a problem. Obviously, it's a catastrophic issue and its impact is catastrophic, but the idea is that we're going to learn from that, that this is going to help us transform. So there's a change in relationship between, in my world of international relations and international security, the thing to be defended and the threat that we're defending it from. It seems that not only is coronavirus, it's a threat, but it's a different type of threat. It's a threat that's also enabling, or that we should enable it to enable us to think differently and to do differently. Secondly, we understand that the impact of the coronavirus is to do with us. So when we look at blame, when we look at problems, when we look at trying to understand how to govern in relationship to the problem of COVID-19, we're also thinking about our culpability. Why is it that the death toll in America is higher than other countries or lower than other countries? It's been coronavirus, COVID-19, the crisis has been very much enabled a whole set of national and regional self-reflections, like a learning process of how we are enwrapped and within this problematic rather than external to it. Now, as I said earlier, I don't think that this is sort of unique to COVID-19. I think if we were to think more broadly, we could understand the anthropocene. If you haven't come across that term, it's like a term, environmental crisis, global warming, the whole planet is like heating up and stuff is being ruined and destroyed. And it's quite possible the planet would be unlivable for us and for other species. And it's like we're setting fire to our own home, literally and metaphorically. The thing about the Anthropocene is it's like anthropos as in human, that this isn't something that's just happened. Isn't it like we've been really good and well behaved and something really unjust and has come and hit us? In discussions about the Anthropocene as a sort of human-induced problem, as anthropogenically caused by humans, caused by our inattention to issues of the environment and care of multi-species and thinking about the future, just assuming that the environment and nature was just there for us to extract and draw as much out of as we could, as if there was, an endless stock of stuff. Sounds ridiculous, but that's how people believed that we thought about it. Our ways of accounting and valuing things did not really value stuff in the long term. We just valued the stuff that we extracted and we priced that in a market. The point that I'm making is that in the Anthropocene, in this sort of period where we understand what we call the unintended, or what people say, unintended effects, side effects, externalities, things that we didn't think about, those those actions have consequences. So the understanding is that those consequences are caused by us, not because we were bad people, but because we didn't understand our entangled relationality to the world. And in that world, when we see global warming, when we see ocean acidification, we see other things, we're thinking that this is a lesson. Even though this is catastrophic, it's saying to us how we should be governing ourselves. We should be governing in response to these effects. So when I was talking about how governance goes upside down and inside out, rather than us being humans and really clever and like having reason and science and brilliance and a telos of progress, and the world just being there and amenable as an object to our demands and our needs and our development, we see that things are beginning to be turned around, that the world isn't there just amenable for us to continue extracting, and we don't look as big and clever and wonderful as we thought we did. In the same way as America doesn't look so big and clever and wonderful as it did according to the Global Preparedness Study. It's a transformation in how we think of ourselves in relationship to problems, in relationship to the world. Now, the consequence of that transformation and understanding is that we begin to rethink what it means to govern in the world. No longer do we have a human-centered, subject-centered, top-down hierarchy pyramid of governance, where we have all the democracy, the reasoning, and the cleverness, and then we act and we initiate things on the world. It's like the opposite. We're governing backwards, governing in reverse. The world begins to tell us what to do. The world begins to say, we're dying, we're heating up, we're on fire, we're acidifying, we're having species wipeout. There's all sorts of coronaviruses due to unhealthy mixtures of humans and nature without barriers and without thinking about it and without duties of care and duties of responsibility and without the right regulation and the right management. So the world begins to give us an agenda to govern ourselves. If you're into like discussions of biopolitics and these sorts of things, there's a Giorgio Agamben. He writes an awful lot, but some of the things he writes about are about how we govern differently in relationship to a crisis of modern understandings. One thing I particularly like from his work is his idea of the governance of effects rather than causes. So in a modernist fantasy, when we have science and technology and we understand causes and how things work, we're enabled to go out and impact more, and the world obeys us because we have a universal understanding of science. What Agamben's pointing to is that once we lose that centeredness, that confidence, that understanding of a universal causality, and move into a more entangled and complicated and non-linear world, we're forced to be governed by effects. We govern responsively. And in that way, it has a very different impact in terms of how we think about issues of democracy, rights, citizenship, and all those things. If you think about it, reason is no longer in the building because we're no longer in charge, and how we get to decide how we should be in charge and what we should do is much less important when there is other actors, i.e. the world and environmental crisis and other crises such as COVID-19, where we are responding afterwards. We're reacting to things. So I'm still really just setting up my discussion. Oh, and I see I've got 10 minutes left. So that's not a problem because its most important thing is to set the general scene. That's what we do in plenaries. So all I wanted to do in my 10 minutes is to talk about the aspects of my subtitle, process ethics, what's going on there. I've already intimated a little bit about how we govern differently, and then potentially the more authoritarian negative side effects. So we're governing differently. We're governing after the fact. So essentially, governing becomes a process where we're always within. We're always inside a process of problem, solution, problem, solution. Now, I'm not sure, I don't know the audience. There was this guy, Ulrich Beck, he died a few years ago. He's like one of the best known sociologists of the global sphere. He came up with ideas like risk society, the precautionary principle. When globalization was a thing, maybe you haven't heard of globalization, but before the Anthropocene, people were into globalization in the 90s and the 2000s especially. And some of the tropes, some of the issues and ways of thinking are a little bit similar to our contemporary Anthropocene discussions. Anyway, Ulrich Beck was a key thinker about how our governance understandings were impacted by an entanglement and the end of an outside. Anyway, the point that he made, he is not the only one. There's Anthony Giddens, there's other global sociologists, Mike Featherstone, etc. No time to go into any of those things. The point is that governing is recursive. Governing, as I already intimated, doesn't start and initiate things. Governing is always a response to things that always happened. We're already always in the middle of governing. In that way of doing it, and that way of thinking, it's clear that governing, humans, subjects, we're always like not separate from the world. We don't have the freedom to just do what we want to, because the world is, as Ulrich Beck says, setting a normative horizon. Now, it sets a normative horizon in the sense that we don't just have science and technology and transform things. On the other hand, we don't just say it's relativism, anything goes, what can we do? You know, no one knows anything. No, the world empirically sets a normative horizon that enables us to rethink. Now, the reason why I said I don't think COVID-19 is an event or a break that changes everything, but it's part of a broader context, is, as I said, Ulrich Beck's been dead for a few years. One of the last things he wrote, though, was a wonderful article called, interestingly, Emancipatory Catastrophism. See, already sounds a little bit funny. Emancipatory catastrophism, associating one thing that sounds quite good, emancipation, freedom, those things, with a thing that sounds quite bad, catastrophism. And what he's responding to is Hurricane Katrina in 2008, the breakdown of the floods and the levees around New Orleans, and the sort of the personal economic disaster that was that. And so even before coronavirus became our friend, enabling us to rethink how we think about things, we were already beginning in some of our most important and influential academics and thinkers. Ulrich Beck is not a marginal or even a specifically radical thinker, already thinking about how we turn things around. So for Ulrich Beck, Hurricane Katrina, again, revealed to us, I don't know how many times it's going to have to happen, that America isn't as brilliant and wonderful as we thought it was, that actually the way that America is governed, the way that New Orleans is governed, was problematic, because the impact of Hurricane Katrina revealed to us the sort of racial capitalism, the racial divisions within America, the economic inequalities of access to health and provisions, the way that the policing was organized and run, and particularly the way that we thought about water and waterways and flooding, because the one law that seems to come up in the Anthropocene is that the more we try and build walls and levees against flooding, the worse the flooding is going to be, because we're continuing to refuse that flooding, as with COVID-19, is telling us something, that we need to be doing things differently. We need to be organizing differently. So the point that I'm making is that we were already sensitizing ourselves to how we govern through disaster, how we realize that it's a little bit like it's all about us. It's like when things happen, when things go wrong, that's how we enables us to rethink our social ordering and our social ways of working and our social ways of governing. So, so that's like a process, and it's a process ethics where we're continually sensitizing ourselves to effects, which we then read as consequences of our social ordering, and in fact, consequences of things that we hadn't necessarily thought about before. So it becomes a process. Another author, academic, policy person, Amartya Sen. Not sure if you've come across his work, but he's a very well-known process theorist. He has a famous book, in some quarters, a famous book from 1999, Development as Freedom, thinking of development not in numbers and quantities of GDP, amount of money you have, but in a context, development as an enabling process. So you're no longer measuring things, you're looking at capacities, potentials, possibilities, and you're making a differentiation, because in different countries, different regions, different areas, people are going to be more vulnerable than others. People will be affected differently by other things. So we move away in a process understanding, we move away from saying these things are good and these things are bad. We move away from traditional forms and metrics of representation, ways of thinking of individuals or countries or states as secure, strong, efficient, because we realize that it all depends on the relationships and the relationships inside and those vulnerabilities. So the more negative side of that is when we're thinking about the unintended consequences, the side effects of our actions, it makes it very difficult to do things, because when we do things, we realize that in a social order, in a world of numerous hierarchies, intersectional understandings of disabilities, it's going to be very difficult to do something without impacting on people, impacting in ways that we hadn't thought about and we hadn't understood. If we understand about how COVID-19 makes us think differently about who has guidance and who hasn't, the role of like poorly paid 0 hours workers on contracts, how we treat our hospital staff and all the rest of it. If New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina makes us rethink all the issues and the inequalities and the bad practices, you can see that it becomes very easy to problematize things and very difficult to justify things. So in my like 2 minutes, only one thing I might say is that, especially as we're doing a conference event here, when we're thinking about doing academic conferences, say in 2022, people are going to say, yeah, but this is just going to help people with privileges. You need to check your privileges, Chandler, because, you know, only people in certain parts of the world will be able to go and do this and travel, because we all know that the coronavirus 19 vaccines are hugely unequally distributed. So therefore, if you did something like organize a conference in a face-to-face way in 2022, you would just be perpetrating and intensifying already existing inequalities and hierarchies in an academic framework. Therefore, the tendency would be, and these are good arguments, the tendency would be, well, no, maybe we should just keep this online. And you can see the way that that argument would work and creates quite a high level of moral pressure against doing things. So it's like, that's why I would call it anthropocene authoritarianism. It's not so much about laws and policing, but an ethics. Once you realize that you're embedded ethically within sets of processes with unintended consequences that continue obviously infinitely, but maybe you can't track them like that. And no one is saying it's actually your fault for making those inequalities. It's just like young people going into a bar or whatever. They're not really thinking about the consequences that they have on the low paid service workers in the vicinity and all the rest of it. So it's not about liberal rights and responsibilities in a modernist era of an autonomous subject. We're talking about embedded and entangled relationalities where the duty is to think about the vulnerabilities of those which are indirectly affected. So you can see that that's quite a constraining, you might say helpfully constraining, but other people might say, well, actually, you know, this just creates new ways of regulating and restricting, new hierarchies of inclusion and exclusion. Anyway, so that's just a few things to think about. So yeah, I've got 40 seconds left, but I think that's fine. I'm just going to turn this off. Over to Raphael. Microphone, Raphael.